and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 207th episode, our guest is Jonathan Malesic. Jonathan Malesic is a writer and former tenured college professor, sushi chef, and parking lot attendant. His essays have been recognized as notable in Best American Essays 2019 and 2020, and Best American Food Writing 2020, and have received special mention in the Pushcart Prize anthology in 2019. His work has appeared in the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, America, Commonweal, Notre Dame Magazine, the Hedgehog Review, Chronicle of Higher Education, and elsewhere. He has been the recipient of major grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Louisville Institute. His first book, Secret Faith in the Public Square, won a ForeWord INDIES Gold Medal for the religion category in 2009. His next book, The End of Burnout, will be published by the University of California Press on Friday, December 10th, 2021. He holds a Ph.D. from the University of Virginia and teaches writing at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And now on to the show.
Yeah, my name is Jonathan Malesic. I am a writer living in Dallas, Texas, and the author of The End of Burnout.
Yeah, and I'm reading your book, as I mentioned before we started recording, and I wanted to see if you could just kind of start where your book starts, in that you were teaching and you had your own experience with the burnout. So if you could kind of just start there and kind of paint the picture for people how you encountered this topic in your own life.
Yeah, exactly. I had been a college theology professor, and in fact that had been my dream job for years. I spent basically my entire 20s in graduate school preparing for this job, and then I got it. I got my dream job, and things went well for several years, and one of the topics I was interested in when I was teaching was kind of work as a moral and spiritual question. And so I designed a class called Why Work. I did research on this topic. And then at some point, I kind of became the thing I was studying. I became a dissatisfied, unhappy American worker who could no longer explain to himself why he was working. I found it harder and harder just to get out of bed in the morning. I was showing up to work barely on time. Preparing for class became much more difficult. I would be just racking my brain. The night before I had to teach, just unable to think of how to teach some material that I had often taught several times before, but my brain just wasn't working. And after a couple years of that, I took a semester of unpaid leave just to kind of clear my head and rest and hopefully rediscover why this had been my dream job. And so I took a semester away from the college, and I came back to work, and my 5 months of rest helped for about 1 week. And I was right back to where I had left off, just as miserable, short temper, difficulty planning, and just no desire to continue doing this job. And so fortunately, my wife got a very good job offer in the Dallas area. And so when she signed her contract, I signed my letter of resignation. And in the months after that, I started to think about what had happened to me. And I started reading about burnout, and it made a lot of sense of my situation. I should say this was almost 6 years ago that this happened. And at the time, the public conversation about burnout was not at all what it is now. And so I was diving into all the psychological literature, And I discovered, well, this is it. This phenomenon explains what happened to me and why I ended up hating my dream job. And
Hmm.
so I just decided to keep researching it and to try to understand it for my own sake and for the sake of now, millions of other people who are going through something similar.
Yeah, definitely. And I also mentioned before we started, I was an elementary education major, and I am not a teacher now. And a lot of the friends I made while I was in school for teaching are also not teachers anymore. So this is a very common story that I've heard from other teachers. Now, do you think, I know you talk about this being a society-wide problem, and I have absolutely no doubt it is, but do you think there is something intrinsic to teaching that is susceptible to this, especially?
I think that, yeah, what makes teachers especially susceptible is that they're very caught in the, I don't know, the metaphor that just popped into my head is like, the claws or the pincers
Mhm.
of burnout. Um, because teachers, well, the burnout is caused by uh, the gap between your ideals for work and the reality of your job. And so, if you go into work, as most of us do, with pretty high ideals, and if you go into your workplace and the conditions don't support those ideals, then your likelihood of burning out is much greater. And I think
Mhm.
teachers are an idealistic bunch. Teachers go in with a noble mission to educate, young people. Um, but as we know, the conditions in which teachers labor often don't measure up to those ideals.
Mhm.
It's always a battle to fund education at just about every level. And the school districts and colleges and universities are often putting more and more pressure on their faculty. Salaries get frozen, and there are ever more administrative tasks and assessment tasks that need to be done. And so it's no surprise that teachers feel this, have this strong experience of burnout.
Mhm. Well, and you also mentioned that a lot of your classes that you were teaching were required classes that weren't in the majors of the students that were taking it. So it wasn't like this was just something they had to take to graduate, and you weren't really feeling the response, I guess, intellectually from the students. And I'm sure that that has to figure into it a little bit too, because I mean, I definitely had some classes when I was in school that I had to take to graduate that I wouldn't have probably occurred to me to take on my own. So I definitely understand that that dynamic for sure. But
Right. Exactly. So I taught theology, and my students, and it was a Catholic college, and so every student had to take theology. And the students, they just outright told me. I mean, I should caveat that by saying I had many wonderful students and
mhm.
tremendous fond memories of working with many of them. But students would say outright, "This class doesn't matter. This is only a core class. Why do you take it so seriously?" Well, the reason I take it so seriously is I've devoted my entire life to it. And, and that's again, that those are my ideals. And, the students, the people who are meant to benefit from my labor, did not share those ideals. And so,
Yeah.
there was almost no way I was going to get back what I felt I was putting in.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I was an elementary school teacher and those kids had to be there by law. So it wasn't
Right.
like it wasn't like they were there by choice either. So I definitely understand that dynamic. But I do think it's interesting when we talk about burnout that like you mentioned in the book, it's hard to define and our definitions of it changed over the time periods that we're talking about in history. So was wondering if you could walk through a little bit of the history of how people even define burnout, because it seems like it's a pretty unscientific. I mean, it's changed so much what we even mean by that or what terms it goes by over the years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, burnout is in the scheme of human history. Burnout is a very new phenomenon. The term got started being used in relation to work kind of informally in the 1960s. There are some reports in the late 1960s of workers, in particular, I want to say, social workers and other people in sort of the human services profession, using that term to describe the emotional toll that their work was taking on them. But then it was in the mid 1970s, so 1973, 74, that psychologists got a hold of the term and started theorizing it. And the history of that, of their sort of discovery, in a sense, of burnout is, to me, I think, really interesting. It's a simultaneous discovery by two psychologists working totally independently on opposite sides of the United States and coming to very similar diagnoses and definitions of this problem of burnout. So you had Herbert Freudenberger, who was a clinical psychologist in New York City, working at a free clinic it was called the St. Mark's Free Clinic in New York's East Village, and Christina Maslach, a research psychologist working in the psychology department, first at Stanford University and then UC Berkeley. And they both identified this term almost at the exact same time. And they described it in similar but sort of complementary ways. Freudenberger really emphasized the ideals. He looks at these free clinic volunteers as idealistic workers who are faced with the massive need of the people they're trying to serve, and nothing they do can meet that need ultimately. And so they have all kinds of symptoms that Freudenberger identifies as burnout. And then Maslach on the West Coast really focuses on the working conditions of people in human services professions. So counselors, social workers, poverty attorneys, and a few others. And eventually, Maslach identifies the three main components of burnout: of exhaustion, cynicism, or the kind of more technical term she sometimes uses, depersonalization. So the idea that you see your students as problems rather than as people, or you see your coworkers as problems, or something like that. And the third component is a reduced sense of effectiveness at work. So those three things, exhaustion, cynicism, and ineffectiveness, are the classic psychological definition of burnout.
Mm-hmm.
But in the culture at large, we talk about burnout in much looser terms than that. Psychologists themselves, unfortunately, don't all agree with each other on this definition. And the general public, there's virtually no agreement. And a big reason that I wrote the book was to kind of set our public conversation about burnout on a direction where we can be a lot more precise. And we can say, okay, this is burnout. This is clinical depression, which is, there's quite a bit of overlap perhaps between burnout and clinical depression, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And this is, just a worker who needs an extra day off or something like that. Not every time you're tired from work are you burned out. And sometimes if you think you're burned out, and you settle on that as a definition without kind of looking into what it means, that self-diagnosis of burnout is sometimes concealing clinical depression, which is often much more serious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was going to ask about how you can tell the difference between, because a lot of these terms you're talking about sound close to one another, but I guess like there's no blood test for it. So it might be kind of an overlapping thing too, of depression, exhaustion, but you're kind of saying that this is distinct from some of those things, where I guess exhaustion is an element you're saying of burnout, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. The kind of exhaustion that is characteristic of burnout is more than the ordinary tiredness that you
Mm-hmm.
might feel at the end of a difficult week, or at the end of a project, or the end of a semester, or something like that. In my case, my exhaustion did not improve after 5 months of rest. The only thing that ended my exhaustion was quitting my job. And I think that's also why clinical depression is not the right description for what happened to me, at least. Because as soon as I quit, well, I mean, it took a little time to kind of, remake my self-understanding as a worker, and embark on a new career. But, once I left the job, I stopped feeling quite so bad. The problem was, localized in my work. And that's not how clinical depression is. Like, it just stays with you.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just work related.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder, and this kind of made me think of the way we think of marriage nowadays. It's like people nowadays expect to marry for love. Like that's the expectation of when we look for a partner. It wasn't that way always. And I think for most of the history of marriage, it was more of like a business arrangement, if anything, a way to keep, land in the family or some, dowry. And it's more of a transactional thing. And only recently have we started to even think of it as related to romance and love and genuine affection and anything more than just a deal we make. And I wonder if you think of the kind of change we've had in work the same way, because it's like I don't know that people maybe even expected to be fulfilled by their jobs. It's like for the most part back in the day, and maybe this is more of a modern phenomenon that we expect to. I mean, I'm glad it's that way. I love my wife, and I'm glad I have a job I'm interested in. But I'm just saying, like I expect to have those things now. I don't expect anything else. But maybe our expectations were different, as a society back, a while back. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's totally true, not only about marriage, but also about work. And, it's kind of interesting that we sometimes talk about marriage as work too.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, in both cases, there are our ideals are so much higher than they were in the past. And the ideal of work as a place of not just economic productivity, but of identity formation and self-expression and a sense of transcendence is also is about as old as the concept of burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Betty Friedan, writing the Feminine Mystique in 1960 or so, argued that this problem that has no name that women in the United States were experiencing, and she was looking, primarily at women who were graduates of elite colleges. So these are women who had pretty high ideals for themselves, and but they had this kind of nameless problem of fulfillment. And Friedan argued that in the post-war United States, we had solved the problem of productivity. And now work became not primarily a question of how productive are you, but how how can you use your work to express who you are? And it's shortly after that change in mindset. And I think Friedan is not just kind of, like she didn't just inaugurate this mindset, but was reacting to a shifting mindset. Soon after that change in mindset, that expectation that work is not just about productivity, but is about meaning, this problem of burnout appears when our ideals become higher and higher. And then beginning in the 1970s, the conditions of work got worse and worse for the typical American worker.
Mm-hmm.
Wages stagnated, work became more precarious. It inaugurated the era of mass layoffs. And so burnout is this response. And our what I call our burnout culture is a culture-wide response to the experience of ever-growing ideals for work and diminishing reality of that work.
Yeah, that definitely leads into what I was going to ask you about next, because it just seems like every time I've been at a job and then there was a job alongside my job that got eliminated, it wasn't like someone else was going to do that job. It was just, now we're all going to do this job. like all the people left are now just going to just absorb this into your other job that you were already doing. Like it's always been like that, no matter what job I've been to. Like if that happens, like you're just, now it's your problem. And it's like you're still expected to do the same work you did before, but now just this too. And I feel like with that shift you talk about, and especially with the gig economy and the rise of temps and contractors and more transient types of work on the periphery, that's definitely just become the case for all workers. I feel like that's just a society-wide thing we've had to deal with all over.
Yeah, totally. It's and it's one that's been well documented by by a lot of historians and economists lately, that we're in this era of ever growing expectations on workers, but also ever less security for them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, if you think of like my grandparents' generation, it's like you had one job for 40 or 50 years and then you retired and then that was it. It's like
Yeah.
I can barely fit, and I've had I feel like a good, I'm not saying this as someone who thinks I had a bad career, but I can barely fit all the jobs I've had on one one sheet for my resume. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to calculate the number of things I've done and the places I've been and stuff. And I just I don't think it was that way for most people back in the day. It's just like, well, the factory that makes candles or whatever in town is hiring, so that's where you'll be working now. So just enjoy it. And it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
My maternal grandfather worked. I think he worked for the same company his entire life. He
Wow.
worked. He worked for American Standard. The American Standard Radiator Company in Buffalo, New York.
Mm.
He was a union steward. He
Mm-hmm.
was, he worked in quality control, and he must have worked. I mean, he 40 years, maybe. I
Yeah,
mean, he
exactly.
started when he was about, I think, 16. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up unions because I do think the decline in organized labor in general has probably had something to do with everything we're talking about, right? I mean, if you have union protections or you don't have these right to work laws that they have in many states, I think that kind of thing is not as big of an issue, but obviously that hasn't been the case for the last couple decades, right?
yeah, totally. Yeah, right. I mean, the advent, or at least the theorization of burnout in the mid 70s coincides with the height of labor power in the
Mm-hmm.
United States. It was in the early 70s, and this is really well documented by the historian Jefferson Cowie in a book called Staying Alive. It's the workers on the auto lines were kind of agitating. They didn't even just want better pay. They wanted sort of more interesting conditions. They wanted the work to be kind of reorganized so they had more autonomy. And that was the height of their power. And then the kind of at the end of the 70s, really like in 1981, with the air traffic controllers strike, the first demand, or I guess it was the first complaint that the air traffic controllers listed was burnout. And that strike, of course, was broken by Ronald Reagan, and that was kind of like the real downfall of so much labor power in the United States, and it has only fallen further since then, with maybe some hopeful signs in the last year or so.
Yeah, definitely. And growing up in the Midwest, I just feel like this ethic of working yourself to the bone is so ingrained in people. And it's just like this idea of if you don't produce, you shouldn't be allowed to eat, or it's just a very like puritanical, I guess would be the word. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's just there's this mentality that it's like it's good to be like just totally exhausted, and if you're burned out, well, good, you're burned out, you should be burned out, you know what I mean? Like it's just a very like it's a very harsh way to look at things, and I just always I've kind of bristled at that idea, but that's definitely an ethic that I think is very ingrained in many people's psyche, for sure.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, and this is when burnout can be kind of a badge of honor,
Right,
for
exactly.
many. And this, I think, is part of the problem of the definition of burnout, is that in the absence of a really good definition, then, by saying that you're burned out, and you are the only one who gets to say if you're burned out or not,
Right.
then it's kind of a brag, you're kind of saying, I am an ideal worker in this work obsessed culture. I work so hard that I have broken myself in some way, but nevertheless, like the hustle never stops or something like that. And that kind of approach to burnout, I think needs to be kind of examined more carefully. And I think that if we had a clearer sense of what burnout really is, then we could take a step toward breaking open that notion that hard work is the supreme value and the supreme demonstration of our own value as people.
Yeah, definitely. Just going to your book though, what did you find on the flip side of this? Because you've laid out the problem very well, but you were also kind of looking for answers. So where did you go to look for answers of how to fix this problem?
Yeah, I needed to look for answers for how to fix the problem in some unusual places. Because the idea of the work ethic as our supreme measure of value is so pervasive in American culture. I didn't think I was going to find it in a typical company or something like that. And so the first place I went looking was in a Benedictine monastery at the end of a 13-mile dirt road in the New Mexico desert, where this community of about 60 monks, they live as much off the grid as they can. They generate their own electricity, for instance. They don't have telephone wires to their monastery, and they devote their lives primarily to prayer. So they spend about 6 hours a day in communal prayer and, a couple extra hours in private prayer. Like everyone, they have to work to sustain themselves, but they keep work within pretty strict limits. And so they work for only about 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. And when the bell rings, ending the work period, they have to drop what they're doing and go to the chapel and gather together for, another period of communal prayer. Um, and I saw in that monastery, another approach. It's a very different value system than what we practice in what the monks call the world. And I don't think that we all need to go off the grid and become monks and pray 6 hours a day or anything like that, but I saw the monks' approach to work as a kind of limit case for what a good human life could be like if you tried to limit work to just a few hours and you put something else as more important than it. And if the way we live now is the limit case in the other direction, then, well, we need to think about ways that we can, move more in the direction or find, move more in the direction of the monks or find other alternatives that, can put priority on something other than our labor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I was mentioning before we started recording, but I do think that the pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of these problems because there is no lines anymore. It doesn't seem, when you're working from home, you're working from home, you're living at work. The hours, they just bleed into each other, and there's no there's no clear lines about where work stops and where your life begins. It just seems like all one big hustle. So I do think having the ability to put work here and then put something else over here is probably helpful, I would imagine. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the pandemic has it's made so many problems worse.
yeah,
And this is a big one because exactly like you described, that there just isn't a boundary between work and the rest of your life. And some of the alternatives that we've been talking about already are, enforcing that boundary is a big part of it. A union contract sets boundaries.
right.
Having to do your work at the American Standard plant was a boundary for my grandfather.
Right.
He couldn't do his work at home.
Nope.
And at the monastery, the boundary is the absolute obligation to convene in the chapel for prayer. And they don't have a factory whistle, they have the chapel bell. You hear the chapel bell, it's like, okay, well, it's time to change and do this other thing. And like you said, without any boundaries, we're just that much more, we're that much more susceptible to our work simply becoming our life.
Well, especially with these, like you talk about, like these gig worker jobs. I mean, they're always like pushing them to do, one more, like Uber or the grocery delivery one. I forget the name, but yeah, it's like all these ones that just, hey, come on, one more thing, and it's like, no, I want to go home. Like, it's like I'm living. My car is, I get around, but I'm also making money in it, and it's like I'm not actually an employee. Also, that's the other thing. It's like these ride sharing services. You're not actually an employee. You're also a customer, and it's like, what? So,
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the ride sharing and other kind of gig work platforms, they don't allow for limits, and they're And those workers, right? I mean, their legal status helps to make it harder for them to set limits.
Oh yeah. No, for sure. I was wondering if in your solutions you thought that universal basic income was part of the answer, because I'm convinced that that got to be one of the solutions.
Yeah, I think so too. And the reason that I see it as, I wouldn't say it's the only
No, no.
answer, but it's a big part of it. And the reason is that it can enable a a decent life without having to sell your labor on the market, basically.
Hmm.
Um, and it's founded on a notion of universal human dignity. Um, every single one of us, your children, um, if they're school age, then they're not working, and they have dignity. They
Hmm.
have, every bit as much worth as anyone else. And yet somehow we don't accord people that same dignity once they become of working age, unless they're working for pay,
Hmm.
basically. Like, if you want to hold your head up as a good contributor to American society, then you have to have a job, basically.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think that's false.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, we have a dignity.
Yeah.
We were born with inalienable human dignity, and we carry that with us whether we work or not. And a basic income is the sort of economic acknowledgement of that fact, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And we do seem to be moving slowly towards that, although I think we have a long way to go before we actually would get there. With the child tax credit, I think that's a good start. I don't think it's nearly enough to get it all the way there, but I think it's starting to move people in the right direction. And honestly, I wouldn't even think this is necessary if, like you were saying before, like starting in the 70s, where wages never went up and then everything else went up, and it's like if you adjust for inflation, the people have been making roughly the same as they were in the 70s, and it's like you've got CEO profits more detached from regular workers and inflation and everything else. And there's still places that you can pay someone $2 an hour with tips to work a job. And it's just like, what world are you living in? Like this is not enough. Like this, even if you have a job, and that's the one thing I keep getting frustrated about. It's like all these people are, all these people that don't want to work. It's like, well, you don't want to pay people. Like, who can live on this amount of money? Like, like what are you saying? So,
Yeah, and so even though, like, the pandemic made so many things related to our work worse, there are actually, I think, also some glimmers of hope
hmm.
in the experience that some people had, especially early in the pandemic. I mean, of course, we had no idea it was going to go on quite as long as it has, in March and April of 2020. But one of the policies that was very quickly passed was this $600 a week unemployment bonus.
Hmm.
Um, this supplement to state unemployment insurance, and that looks a little bit like a basic income, from the
Hmm.
right angle. And it's at a living wage. Many workers ended up making a little more
Hmm.
um, on that $600 a week unemployment supplement than they did before. And it's hard to say exactly how to read the conditions that we're calling the Great Resignation, but you know workers have, many people, millions of people, just had this experience of making a decent living without having to work at all,
Hmm.
and that memory is fresh. And yeah, like you say, I mean, I think that helps to boost their bargaining power and can say, things don't have to be the way they were before. We could try something different.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, it's a very interesting book. I definitely suggest people should read it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very enjoying it very much. One thing I do ask always here towards the end is what music have you been listening to lately?
Oh gosh, lately, I am one of my hobbies is cycling.
Nice.
And I listen to music a lot. I listen to podcasts a lot while I'm cycling. When I'm not listening to music, when I'm not listening to podcasts, I've been listening to a lot of Neil Young lately.
Nice.
And,
I love Neil Young.
Oh yeah. And I don't know, what Neil Young which is your favorite Neil Young, I guess?
Oh boy. I like the early stuff. Down by the river and that early era. Harvest Moon. Yeah, I like the early 70s era, I think. But I love him with Crazy Horse too. So I'm not, I love that stuff too. It's hard to say. He's one of my favorite guitar players too. So
yeah, he gets mentioned in the book. I actually don't quote the line, "It's better to burn out than to fade away," which that
was too obvious, I guess.
Right. But it's in Ambulance Blues, which was, I think, in 1974. There's a line, all along the Navajo Trail, burnouts stub their toes on garbage pails. And so, I think Neil Young was kind of picking up on the same thing in the culture that Freudenberger and Maslach were picking up on. Dylan has a line also in what song? Shelter from the Storm. I was burned out from exhaustion. And that's, also, I think, 1974 recording. Anyway, Neil Young, very good for thinking about burnout. But yeah, lately I've been listening to late 80s, early 90s Neil Young.
Wow. Okay.
Because he's on Ragged Glory and Freedom, Harvest Moon. He's kind of my age. He's in his mid 40s there. And what I love is that he just keeps going. He's a kind of a testament that you're not washed up once you're in middle age. You can still do great things, and I kind of take some inspiration from that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what album he did a couple years ago that I loved with him. Oh, I think it was Americana. Have you heard that one?
No, I haven't.
It's all old timey folk songs, but he just bashes through them with Crazy Horse, and it's awesome.
Oh, wow.
He's got "Oh Susanna," "Clementine," "This Land Is Your Land." It's all these old timey folk songs, but it's with Crazy Horse, so they're going nuts. But
wow.
It's a fun album. I would definitely check it out.
All right, yeah, I gotta listen to that on my next bike ride.
Oh yeah, for sure. But well, hey, thanks so much for taking all this time this evening. I'm glad we finally got it worked out with the technical issues. But you're welcome to come back anytime. Hope I didn't burn you out.
No. Yeah, it was great talking with you, Rob. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Cool. Well, have a good rest of your night. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Yeah, you too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Join the Rob Burgess Show mailing list. Go to tinyletter.com/The Rob Burgess Show and type in your email address. Then respond to the automatic message. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review everywhere the podcast is available, including iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, RSS, and now Spotify. The official website for the podcast is www.therobburgessshow.com. You can find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. If you have something to say, record a voice memo on your smartphone and send it to therobburgessshow@gmail.com. Include voice memo in the subject line of the email. Also, if you want to call or text the show for any reason, the number is 317-674-3547. Until next time.